The Auction by The Blade07, a Batman all-media types fanfic rated for mature audiences, with additional tags for identity reveal, secret identity, identity porn, angst and hurt comfort, angst with a happy ending, auction, human trafficking, alternative universe, canon divergence, sex pollen, cuddle pollen, poison ivies, plants and vines, Dick Grayson is Nightwing, Jason Todd is Red Hood, Dick Grayson needs a hug, Jason Todd tries to be a good sibling, protective Jason Todd, POV Dick Grayson, hurt Dick Grayson, emotional hurt comfort, no Batcest, no Bat family incest, non-consensual drug use, and non-consensual touching. Summary. Dick Grayson was nabbed on his drive home from work. He easily could have escaped his captors, but not without drawing suspicion to his nightlife. Forced to play along with his kidnapping, Dick ends up being auctioned off to the highest bidder, who just so happens to be the mysterious and terrifying Red Hood himself. Can Dick escape from the Hood? And what does he want with a civilian cop anyway? Unless, somehow, he knows Dick's secret identity? Chapter 1. Sold to number 107. Generally, someone as capable and cool-headed as Dick Grayson did not end up in situations that were outside of his control. Throughout his life, he rarely found himself completely and utterly helpless. In fact, he had only felt this way twice before, excluding tonight, when his parents fell to their deaths, and when he learned Jason had been murdered. Now, thousands of leering gazes enveloped Dick where he was kneeling on the stage, naked except for a pair of small, tight black boxers, which left little to the imagination. Overstimulated and nauseous, Dick let his head drop, gaze pinned to the wooden floor of the stage in front of him. He shivered involuntarily, as a result of both his lack of clothing and the pollen coursing through his system, because they nabbed him when he was on his way home from work, as Officer Grayson, not Nightwing. There's no way the people who took him would be able to capture him if he had allowed himself to seriously fight back. But protecting his identity came first. Dick didn't even have a domino or his cocky Nightwing persona to hide behind. It was a good thing they didn't know about his nightlife, because Dick could only imagine what kind of low-life bidders Nightwing would attract to a human auction. At least as Dick Grayson, his odds of being bought by someone like Slade or Deathstroke were all but non-existent, thank God. That didn't mean his situation was good by any means. However, at least chances were high that whoever purchased him, what a disturbing thought, would severely underestimate his ability to escape and fight back, likely resulting in a clean and quick escape. But even as he deduced this, and reasoned that he had no real cause to worry, Dick winced as the effects of the pollen began to set in. Despite his best efforts to appear unaffected, his teeth chattered uncontrollably around the ball gag. After experiencing his esteemed company for a few hours, his captors quickly realized the only way to shut Dick up was to gag him. Though he wasn't quite there yet, soon it would be the only thing preventing Dick from begging for touch. For any human contact. Hell, he'd even take a slap or a punch to escape the pain and the cold. For the first time, the pollen felt like the torture it was designed to be. Dick had never been this cold before. Every other time he had been exposed to cuddle pollen, Batman, Damien, or Tim had been there to help him ride it out. Usually his symptoms never got further than him feeling mildly chilly, like it was a cool fall day and he had forgotten to wear a sweater. Now it was as though he was enduring a never-ending brain freeze and trapezing through the Arctic while running a fever, all at once. He squirmed futilely. It was torture to be surrounded by people, the only balm for the effects of Ivy's pollen, and not be able to touch a single one of them. Not that Dick wanted to cuddle up to a bunch of human traffickers, and rapists, and criminals. Not when he was in his right mind, anyway. But his sanity was slipping further and further out of his reach with every passing moment the drug remained in his system. Who called the cops? The obnoxious auctioneer laughed boisterously at his own joke, as he leaned down to grope Dick's peck. Using the last of his self-control, Dick refrained from melting into the touch. No matter how good the hand felt on his skin, still, he couldn't bring himself to pull away either. He bit his tongue, restraining a moan of pleasure as the auctioneer cupped a hand under his chin and forced him to raise his head from where he had been stubbornly glaring at the ground to face the sea of ravenous bidders. Richard Grayson, ward of the infamous playboy and multimillionaire Brucey Wayne, is 19 years old, has dazzling blue eyes and lovely thick black hair, and, as you can see, a body to die for. Richard is a college dropout, who went on to become the youngest detective in the GCPD, with a killer intellect and an even better body. Grayson is the true prize of tonight's auction. He is the perfect pet. Dick bristled, annoyed and sickened at being referred to as a pet. For any ladies or gentlemen interested in acquiring their very own handsome, clean, and impressively fit cop, perfect for living out your kinkiest fantasies, Dick would have mock-gagged dramatically if not for the gag. As was, he tried to convey his disgust with his eyes. While he wasn't particularly into any kinks, Dick had nothing against people doing whatever the hell got them off, with a consenting partner. The key word being consenting. Bidding starts at $30,000, and don't forget, each of our products has been sufficiently dosed with enough sex pollen to last you a guaranteed night of fun. Now, let's hear those bids. Dick whimpered through his gag as the announcer pulled away, and the cold returned with a vengeance, prickling at his skin like thousands of needles, sending pain shooting through his body. Dick had been stabbed, shot, beaten, and poisoned in his tenure as Robin, and then Nightwing. Yet, somehow, this was the worst pain he'd ever been in. It was a small comfort to know that Ivy would likely hunt down all the people who had stolen and sold her pollen and make them regret it. It was a common misconception that Ivy's cuddle pollen was actually sex pollen, for good reason. While cuddle pollen in no way stirred in its host sexual arousal, or arousal in anyone around them, it certainly made its victims crave human contact, no matter the cost, while inhibiting one's ability to think clearly, which made raping those affected by it worryingly easy. Dick sincerely doubted he could let go of anyone once they initiated contact, no matter what else they decided to do with him while he was getting it. This thought terrified him, that pretty soon he would be begging whoever bought him to touch him and relieve the unbearable haze of pain and cold. With a kind of dread mixed with anticipation, Dick waited impatiently for the bids to end so he could get some relief. He didn't care anymore what they did to him. The fear was long gone and replaced by a burning need for touch. Please, please, please. I hear 30,000. Do I hear 35? 35 to number 82. Do I hear 40? 40,000 to number 5. 45. Do I hear 45,000? Dick hung his head once more, trying to clear his head and failing. The only thing he could think about was being touched. 100. Gasps rippled through the audience as everyone in the room turned to face the man who had just bid 100 grand on Dick. Even through the burning need for touch, the pain, and the freezing cold, Dick stared at the man in horrified recognition. Hood's signature red helmet, coupled with his brown leather jacket, were dead giveaways. His jaw dropped. That was Red Hood. The Red Hood, the up-and-coming crime boss who had been wreaking havoc in Crime Alley. The brutal killer who delivered a duffel bag full of severed heads to send a message. The criminal who had been dead set on murdering Batman and all of his associates for the past 3 months, ever since his rise to power in the seedy underworld. The announcer squealed in excitement. 100 grand was an insane amount of money for one person, even for the son of Bruce Wayne. For a moment, Dick's panic cleared his head enough to think, no, please, someone else, anyone else. Even if he didn't realize he was Nightwing, this guy was seriously dangerous, and certifiably insane, rivaling even the Joker, which was kind of fitting, since Red Hood was just a play off the Joker's old alias. Yet another reason not to like the guy, and whatever Hood wanted with Dick couldn't be good. Dick held his breath, hoping for someone to top the bid. 107. $100,000 going once. Going twice? Please. Sold to number 107. Dick took a shuddering, horrified breath. He was screwed. Chapter 2. Dick is screwed. Dick Grayson was a police officer who decidedly did not possess any notable attributes other than an above-average success rate in solving cases. So why did the Red Hood want him? With a furrowed brow, Dick racked his brain for any explanation, stubbornly refusing to jump to the obvious, although not definitive, conclusion, as it was too terrifying to think about, especially given his current helpless state. He hadn't busted any of Hood's operations, not as Officer Grayson, anyway. He hadn't knowingly come across him in the field while operating underneath his civilian persona, either. So what could have possessed Hood to bid on him? Of course, Hood was a crime lord, and a murderous, sadistic one at that. If the severed heads were any indication of his personality. And how could it not be? Hood was exactly the type of person who would attend a human auction. Dick wanted to entertain the idea out of sheer desperation, because of how dismal the alternative, more obvious explanation seemed. So, he dwelled on the possibility, wondering if perhaps this really was coincidence. Dick had to believe that Hood had seen an attractive police officer and decided to fulfill some kind of weird sexual fantasy. And how sad was it that was Dick's current best-case scenario? No matter how much he wished for it to be so, Dick couldn't quite get himself to believe it. No, until he interacted with Hood, he wouldn't be able to discern the truth. Assuming that Hood knew, only one other person had ever figured out Dick's secret identity. "You're such a show-off," Tim said affectionately, with a gentle nudge to Dick's shoulder, after explaining how he had discovered Dick's stint as Robin at the age of 9. Those fancy flips were a dead giveaway. As proven by the third Robin, discovering Dick's secret identity wasn't impossible. However, it was worth taking into account that Tim had an IQ of 150, and was lucky enough to be present for Haley's circus, allowing him to put the pieces together, draw the connections, and see the parallels. Then, thanks to his obsessive nature, stalkerish tendencies, and excellent memory, he actually came to the correct conclusion, rather than missing or dismissing the connection, as most others had. It was incredibly unlikely that Hood had figured out Dick's identity the same way, but not impossible. He's such a pretty thing. The announcer's obnoxious voice yanked Dick out of his spiral and violently thrust him back into too bright, painful, freezing cold awareness. "You have excellent taste, Mr. Hood. Can we assist you in the transportation, or offer you a little something special for the road?" With a horrible certainty that Dick had zoned out for too long, he slowly lifted his head and kept lifting it. First, he saw the man's legs, then Dick gulped, his holstered guns. As he continued to trail his gaze up the man's body, he scanned for and spotted multiple likely locations of concealed weapons on his, likely, customized brown leather jacket, before finally settling on the familiar, terror-inspiring red helmet. "Are you insinuating that I can't handle a drugged civilian?" Hood said dangerously, voice coming out robotic and inhuman, preceded by a tiny crackle of static. Realizing his error, the announcer quickly raised his hands in surrender. "Of course not, Mr. Hood. I know you can handle him, but that doesn't mean you should have to. Devin likes to make the process as smooth as possible for his clients to maintain close relations, as it were. It's a customer service thing. I have to say it to everyone, no matter how competent, skilled, or downright terrifying they are." Did the announcer have a death wish or something? But Hood just chuckled a slightly distorted sound. You flatterer, you. Did Hood like being called scary? Dick guessed that tracks. Anyways, what do you mean, something special? The casual interest in his tone was concerning. Dick really didn't want to know, but the announcer beamed at Hood's inquiry and quickly began on a seriously disturbing sales pitch. For a mere $1,000 more, you, sir, can be the proud owner of our deluxe VIP package, which consists of top-of-the-line toys, access to multiple grams of several high-quality drugs, including, but not limited to, sex pollen, flunitrazepam, and ketamine. But that's not all. No, sir. The deluxe pack also comes with a leash and engraved collar, perfect for walking your purchase. Dick tried, and failed, to swallow nervously around the ball gag. The thing prevented him from moving his mouth very much, and, therefore, made it impossible to swallow. How the hell could this possibly get worse, you ask? By being forced to continuously intake multiple highly addictive, extremely dangerous drugs that impair mental functions. Horrified, Dick stared at Hood, and hoped against all hope that the guy would refuse. The guy hated drug dealers, right? The distributors and dealers' autopsy reports were always brutal after Hood was through with them. And besides, $1,000 was a good amount of money, and maybe after spending so much on Dick, he wouldn't be so inclined to spend any more on this bullshit. I'll take it. There was no mistaking Hood's intentions now. Unless, of course, he both knew Dick was Nightwing and still wanted to fuck him. And wasn't that just the best of both worlds? Dick groaned, which had the unfortunate side effect of reminding Hood of his presence. Hood's gaze slid over to him with the intensity of a copter's searchlight, and Dick stiffened up. Taking a few steps closer, Hood took a knife out of a concealed compartment in his jacket. Dick had started struggling against his restraints, humiliatingly, not to cringe away from them, but to lean closer to Hood. Stupid fucking Pollen is screwing with his survival instincts. Dick eagerly leaned forward as Hood reached down with one leather-clad hand. When he brushed his thumb against Dick's chin to wipe away a trail of drool, he hadn't been able to swallow, and it had been accumulating for the last 12 hours. He finally escaped the cold. It was like sitting in front of a blazing fire after spending days stranded in a blizzard. It would be even better if Hood took off his gloves, adding the feeling of sipping hot cocoa wrapped in an electric blanket. Still, the relief, subtle as it was, had Dick letting out a delighted moan. The hand stilled, and moments later, Hood was pulling away. Dick tried to chase after the warmth, but was quickly halted by the ropes strained against the metal hooks on the floor, keeping Dick anchored in place and on his knees. Dick let out a pathetic whimper at the loss of contact, at the loss of warmth. "Someone's eager," the announcer said with a snide laugh. "That sex pollen sure is potent stuff. I'd kill to get my hands on a fraction of the amount they dosed the merchandise with." Hood ignored the comment in favor of using his knife to cut away Dick's ball gag. It fell to the ground with a dull thud. Finally, Dick could move his mouth. He did so slowly, flexing his aching jaw, muscles spasming after being forced to maintain the unnatural gape for so long. He cleared his dry throat, and his voice was hoarse and near unrecognizable, even to his own ears, as he spoke. "Please, please, Hood. Hood, please. I'll be good. I'll do whatever you want, Hood. Hood." The desperation in his own voice even startled Dick. Hood would think he was pleading for sex, given the substance he was currently under the influence of was dubbed sex pollen, but Dick just wanted touch. Any touch. Hood made an indistinct sound, distorted by his voice modulator. "Sorry," Hood finally said after a lengthy pause, tone indifferent, "but it's not time to go just yet. You can wait a little longer for it, can't you, Dickie?" The use of the familiar, affectionate nickname in Hood's eerie mechanical voice made Dick shiver. His mouth clicked shut. Begging was hopeless. Dick let his head hang helplessly and blinked rapidly against tears. Getting warm wasn't going to happen. Not now, and maybe not ever if Hood didn't want it to. He could just leave Dick like this for days until the pollen ran its course through his system. Longer if he wanted to give Dick another dose from the deluxe package. But then the warmth was back. This time increased tenfold, as Hood gently trailed his naked, ungloved hand over Dick's wet cheeks, wiping away his tears. Dick was crying, and he couldn't stop. He wasn't a crybaby, despite what Jason might have had you believe when he was still alive. Dick was tough and maintained a positive, laid-back attitude, even in the face of danger. But the sleep deprivation, Dick hadn't slept since he was taken over 48 hours ago, combined with the effects of the late stages of the pollen, not to mention the anxiety induced by the ball gag, which prevented him from breathing normally, or joking around to keep calm, proved to be the perfect storm to bring Dick to tears. Now he leaned eagerly into Hood's touch, nuzzling against his bare hand, which practically radiated blissful heat. It smelled distinctively of gunpowder and slightly metallic, but Dick didn't mind. It was warm, and that was the only thing that mattered. Without breaking contact with Dick, Hood used his unoccupied hand to cut away his new pet's restraints. The announcer yelped his protest. Dick unceremoniously got to his feet on his aching legs, moving distinctively like the rested Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, as he clumsily and stiffly lunged at Hood. Hood had the knife pressed to Dick's neck, the same knife he was using moments ago to cut his restraints. But Dick didn't care. Hood was so warm, even with his armor. At least Dick was going to die comfortable and warm instead of miserable and cold. Plus, dying would take away the pain and cold for good. It would also take away the warmth, though. Dick willed himself to pull away, but only succeeded in holding on to Hood tighter. He let out a restrained sigh. There was no escape. All Hood had to do was flex his wrist, and Dick's throat would be slit. But he didn't. Instead, once he realized Dick was only hugging him and not attacking him, he stowed his knife back on his person and scooped Dick into his arms with a soft grunt. He was carrying Dick princess style, which was unexpected. Dick pressed his face into the crook of Hood's neck, with a contented sigh. Finally, he stopped crying. This was perfect. "Right this way, Mr. Hood," the announcer said. "Devin will see you now." As he was carried away, Dick couldn't bring himself to care about where they were going. He let his eyes drift shut and pressed as close to Hood as humanly possible. Chapter 3. A Secondary Location. For the first time in what seemed like days, but was really just a few hours, Dick felt warm. Hood carried him with surprising gentleness, one arm firmly supporting his legs, the other looped under his armpits. Still, Dick would rather be safe than sorry. To prevent Hood from unexpectedly dropping him, he wrapped his arms around the crime lord's neck in a vice grip, more concerned about the cold than injury. Dick took deep, greedy breaths. He couldn't get enough. The smell of gunpowder and leather blocked out the pungent, flowery scent of perfume that permeated the auction hall's air. The dreadful announcer led them through a side door, which took them into a series of long, narrow, dark hallways with no windows. In every hallway, there was at least one, if not 3 or 4, armed guards, who nodded respectfully to Hood as they passed them by. Dick wondered whether the lack of windows was due to their being underground, or something else. Unfortunately, the announcer seemed to have no off switch, and he continued with his inane, dehumanizing prattle like it wasn't just his career, but in his nature. The average life expectancy of our products, when exposed to, shall we say, rougher brands of interaction, is 3 months, a whole 2 weeks longer than most trafficking syndicates. He held up 2 fingers as he shared that fact, a proud expression on his face. If you wouldn't mind reporting when your pet stops working, so to speak, it would be much appreciated. Dick's blood turned to ice. Seriously? Were they discussing his death already? Guess I should start picking out flowers for my grave sooner rather than later. Sunflowers are my favorite. Dick slurred. The announcer laughed boisterously, and Hood let out an amused huff. I doubt my pet will last that long. Dick went rigid in Hood's arms as his heart seized in his chest. No, he mumbled, nuzzling further into Hood's neck. Dick will rule the day Ivy invented cuddle pollen. His cheeks burned. Distantly, he knew his behavior was humiliating. Still, self-awareness and the willpower to pull away were 2 very different things. The former of which Dick had a suitable amount of, and the latter of which he possessed absolutely none. Hood chuckled like Dick was an amusing dog. Then again, the crime lord probably treated strays in Crime Alley better than he was apparently planning on treating Dick. I don't suppose I could secure another invitation for when this one expires. Dick groaned helplessly. Of course, Mr. Hood. The announcer shot him a double thumbs up. I'm sure Devon will be happy to accommodate you. Great. Dick took a shaky breath. As soon as the pollen wore off, he could work out how to escape. But until then, he was as good as helpless. While it wouldn't make him happy, Dick would typically be willing to take his chances on a one-on-one fight against Hood. But now, he was drugged, weaponless, weak with hunger, thirst, and fatigue, not to mention trapped in a building who knows where, swarming with human traffickers and armed guards, working for said human traffickers. He didn't like his odds of getting away. A secondary location, in this case, would actually be preferable. They rounded a corner, and the announcer said cheerfully, Devon is right through here. I'll take my leave now. Let me just say, it was a pleasure doing business with... Hood slammed the door behind him, cutting off the announcer mid-sentence. Dick almost smirked, but the desire disappeared when a man spoke. Hood! Welcome, I've been expecting you. Dick lifted his head, surprised to find a well-lit room with a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, a plush white rug on the floor, and a long, long table, the kind of table you want between you and your enemies. A heinous satin tablecloth covers the wooden surface, and on top of it sat a feast fit for a king. In Dick's half-starved, half-delirious state, it was a sight for sore eyes. Every kind of meat imaginable was stacked high on silver platters, and there was plenty of fancy food Bruce usually reserved for when he hosted galas and elitist parties. There was beef Wellington, oysters, deviled eggs, prime ribs, lamb, and more. Dick's stomach growled. At the head of the table sat a tall man, albeit shorter than Hood by a good few inches. His hands were adorned with golden rings, 5 per finger, the very picture of opulent excess. His hair was blonde and oily, slicked back like a villainous stereotype from the 80s and 90s. There were only 2 chairs at the table, each at either head. At Devon's feet, a girl who couldn't have been older than 15 knelt, only in her underclothes. Her body was riddled with bruises, and her eyes appeared glassy and unfocused. Dick felt Hood tense, though only slightly. Devon smirked down at Dick, kicking his legs up to rest them on the girl's shoulders. Even in his dazed state, Dick's rage surfaced. He had to help her. He had to. He made to move, but Hood tightened his grip, reminding him that he was pretty much in the exact same position. Devon, thanks for having me, Hood said briskly, moving to take his seat. He carelessly made to plop Dick down on the ground, untwining his arms from around his neck, with an ease afforded to him by Dick's weakened state. Once again, Dick found himself on the cold, hard ground. No, Hood, please, Dick begged. It was as though he'd broken through ice and fallen into a freezing cold lake. His teeth were chattering, his lungs burned. Behave, pet, Hood said, low and menacing. But then a warm hand was on Dick's hair. He allowed Hood to gently guide him so his head was resting against his leg. Dick gasped in relief, gripping onto the fabric of Hood's pants with both hands. I'm pleased to see you took part in the auction. As he spoke, Devon toyed with his food, twirling his fork aimlessly in his pasta, shifting his legs where they rested on the girl's slim shoulders. Dick hated that he couldn't help her, but then Hood reminded him that they were in the same situation, making Dick cringe. Sure, Dick could handle this kind of thing better than any civilian, but it didn't change the fact that he was helpless, drugged, and exhausted. It'll last me a few days, I expect. Ian informed me that there was another auction I could attend, once he breaks. Right, he had to help himself first. Put on your own oxygen mask before helping others and all that. But as soon as he could, Dick was going to break every bone in Devon's body and get the girl home. Sure, I'll send you the info. Throughout the meal, Hood barely spoke while Devon carried on aimlessly discussing future auctions, bragging about his stellar profit margins, and hinting at wanting more partnerships in the future. Then, with far too much daring, he questioned Hood's morals. Not that I'm complaining, but what made you reconsider my offer? I thought you were strongly against these kinds of cardinal pleasures. Until tonight, that is. Dick went still, waiting with bated breath for the crime lord's response. Hood shrugged one shoulder, eating a bite of steak and chewing slowly before swallowing and giving an answer. The operations I took down were working in my territory without my explicit permission. I didn't even get so much as a lousy few thousand in compensation. You had the decency to reach out and cut me in. That's all I need. As long as you respect me, as long as you understand who Crime Alley belongs to, I'm open to doing business. So this was all a power play. Hood wanted control. Any pathetic fantasy Dick was harboring about Hood being a morally gray vigilante were dashed at that moment. A whimper escaped his lips without his consent. Want me to shut him up? Devon offered, shooting Dick an uncomfortably slimy grin. Dick flinched. I could keep that pretty mouth occupied for you. Dick tightened his grip on the fabric of Hood's pants. A traitorous, pollen-frenzied part of his brain suggested that sucking Devon off would feel good and warm. He let out an involuntary sob, expecting Hood to lift him up and drop him by Devon's feet instead. But Hood merely shifted, placing a possessive hand on Dick's neck. Dick arched into the touch. Nope, I don't share. Devon rolled his eyes, conceding while Dick slumped in relief. By the time dinner finally ended, Dick was falling asleep at Hood's feet, startling awake when his head dipped, and his forehead knocked against the crime lord's calf. Hood's fingers tightened in his hair. His grip wasn't painful, but it was steadying. The men shook hands, and Hood scooped Dick back into his arms. The announcer, who was waiting outside, led them up several flights of stairs, telling Hood goodbye in the parking lot outside the warehouse, where Hood's red bike was waiting. Pollen, still in his system, Dick fell asleep in Hood's arms before they even reached the bike. Chapter 4. How unexpected! Dick didn't open his eyes when he woke up, kept his heart rate slow and even. The pollen had finally worked its way through his system, so he found himself breathing a little easier. Despite the lack of touch-demanding drugs, his head sat resting in the lap of another warm, solid body. Hood. I know you're awake, Dickie. Dick reluctantly opened his eyes, wondering how he'd figured out that he was awake. What tells gave him away? Hood's real voice. It wasn't the mechanized drawl he'd grown familiar with, yet it still sounded like something he'd heard before. Was it possible that he already knew Hood, either as Officer Grayson or as Nightwing? Dick racked his brain for answers, ignoring the voice in the back of his head that morbidly suggested that Hood sounded like an older, grislier Jason. The comparison was laughable. Jason, honors student, bookworm, an all-around fun-loving kid with a heart of gold. And Hood, Batman's nemesis, right after the Joker. B even told Dick to stay away from him. That's how dangerous the guy was. Morning, Dick chirped, with false brightness, slowly moving to sit up, surprised when he wasn't met with resistance. A domino under the helmet? Seriously? Dick muttered. Even B wasn't that paranoid. You wouldn't let me up without whining about the cold, so I waited on getting the solvent. More importantly, how do you feel? You were seriously out of it yesterday. Fine, Dick said honestly. Nothing felt too bad, considering the circumstances. He took a leisurely look around, voice full of false casualness. Nice place you got here. Good rent? The apartment was small. A dingy, cheap-looking kitchenette, a table, and 2 chairs. 2 doors that presumably led to the bedroom and the bathroom, respectively. It was tidy, and there were various weapons laying around in plain sight. Knives on the table, guns hanging on the wall, the usual. Surely Hood couldn't be that stupid, could he? Leaving weapons around? Even if he didn't know Dick was Nightwing, it would be dumb to leave them out around a civilian, too. Not to mention a cop. Dick could hear the distant sounds of city traffic. They were probably still in Gotham, or was that just his hope talking? Hood let out a derisive snort, and Dick directed his attention back to the crime lord. Geez, that's all you have to say to me? Hood said, sounding strangely dejected. Dick blinked at him in confusion. What did the guy want from him? Maybe he thought he'd act scared? Yeah, Dick wasn't doing that. Hood knew he was a police officer, and probably knew about the other stuff for crying out loud. Why would he expect to freak out? But if it's not that, then what? After a moment, Dig gave up on trying to figure out what Hood wanted him to say, and settled for asking the question that had been burning in the back of his mind ever since Hood made his bid. "What do you want with me?" He kept his tone measured. Dick did not expect Hood to scoff and get off the couch, clearly hurt. "Fuck you." Dig simply stared at him in confusion, as the evidently sensitive crime lord stomped into the kitchen. He watched curiously, ready to spring into action at any moment, as Hood took a mug off the counter, aggressively poured in hot water from the electric kettle, before smoothly stalking back over to Dick. Dick wondered whether his plan was to burn him for his audacity to ask simple questions. Instead, a mug of hot cocoa was thrust into one of his hands, and a cell phone into the other. "Your injuries aren't severe. You should be good to go. So call up Batsy and get lost already." Dick felt his soul leave his body. Seriously? Hood knew. There was no denying it. So why did he toss him a phone like it was only natural? An enemy of Batman had Nightwing in his clutches. He knew it, and he was just gonna let him go? Yeah, right. Best to play dumb. For a little while, at least. Batman? Dick blinked, going for doe-eyed and innocent. Why would I call Batman? What? Are you two on the outs again? Call the replacement. Call Babs. I don't give a shit. Call someone and get the fuck out of here. Okay, so he intimately knew. He knew about Batman and Nightwing's fight. He knew Barbara was Batgirl. And he knew about the newest Robin. But why call Tim replacement, though? Was this guy a die-hard Robin 2.0 fan? Doubtable, considering he took the Joker's name, and the Joker was the one who killed Jason. Not that the public knew, but Dick was betting Hood did. Sure, how much should I ask for? Jason shot him a scathing look. What? For ransom, Dick said smoothly. Hood's hands tightened into fists at his side. Interesting. You're not funny, asshole. Dick shrugged. That's highly debatable, but I also wasn't trying to be. If not a ransom, then what? You haven't told me where we are. You and I both know Batsy and his associates will trace the call, whether or not you tell them your location. So I was saving us all some time. But fine, you're in Crime Alley, aka Park Row, Pines Estates, Gotham, America. So you bought me at an auction, engaged in human trafficking, which is super illegal, by the way, and now want me to call the authorities and leave? After spending $100K on me? I have plenty of money, Hood said dismissively. And what did you expect? For me to ignore you? Even I have lines I won't cross. You were defenseless, drugged up, and totally helpless. Something vulnerable leaked into his voice when he asked, What, you wouldn't do the same for me? Dick raised an eyebrow at how unexpected that was, and took a sip of his hot cocoa. It was warm, sweet, and tasty. He licked his lips appreciatively. Why was Hood acting like he knew Dick? Who expected a total stranger to try and rescue them from a human auction? Sure, Dick would. He'd help anyone who found themselves in that situation. Even Hood, if he were able. But it's weird that Hood expected that from him. So personally. So emotionally. Course I would. But I'm me. Hood's posture relaxed, just a smidge. Yeah. The perfect, kind to a fault Dick Grayson. Well, what are you waiting for? Not like I'm gonna dial the number for you. Dick could practically hear the sarcasm dripping from the words. Picture the eye roll under the domino mask. So, all of that talk with Devin and the announcer, that was what exactly? Hood stiffened. You remember all that? I mean, it's a little spotty, but for the most part. Just posturing. Fuck, did you think I was serious? I thought you knew me better than that. Right. Dick didn't know if it was a moment of insanity, or what, but he should probably take advantage of Hood letting his guard down, and stick around for as long as possible. He had to get to the bottom of this, figure out why Hood was acting like he knew Dick, why everything about him, from his voice to his face, was so familiar. He dialed his own civilian number, knowing his phone was probably sitting at the bottom of Gotham Harbor by now. And again, for good measure. He looked up at Hood with a wide, unapologetic smile. Sorry, looks like you're stuck with me for a little while longer. Chapter 5. Zombie Edition. No fucking way, Hood groused. I played hero and nurse, and now you want me to play babysitter? Not happening. Knowing B, there's a whole team of black-haired, blue-eyed orphans just dying to be the one to pick up Nightwing. Try someone else. Dick gave a one-shouldered shrug. Nope, Dick said pleasantly, popping the pea. Fine, I'll drop you off at the cave myself. Come on, we're going for a ride. Dick's ears perked up. Hood knew where the cave was? Curiouser and curiouser. He started listing out the locations of the Bat Fam on his fingers in the vaguest, least informative way possible. B is off-world, Robin is indisposed, Agent A is taking a much-needed vacation. The first in half a decade. Oracle and Cass are currently halfway across the Earth. Why else did you think they didn't come get me before you did? Fuck my life, Hood said, dragging a tired hand down his face. Fine. He backed down. Dick didn't even bother to hide a victorious grin. You can stay the night, but you're out of here first thing tomorrow morning. I don't care if you have to call Clark or one of those colorful Titan bastards. You're not staying here a second longer than necessary. Deal. He held up his empty mug and shot Hood a lopsided smile. Got any more cocoa? Okay, come on. Dick looked up from the magazine he had been pretending to read and tilted his head to the side, peering up at Hood curiously. For the last 20 minutes, Dick had observed Hood quietly sulking, occasionally glancing furtively at his windows, like, despite Dick's assurances, he expected Batman to come swooping in. Now he was standing before Dick, arms crossed, nose wrinkled. I said, let's go. What's up? Listen, man, I appreciate the rescue and all, but I'm terrible at hiding bodies. So, if that's what this is about, you should really ask someone who doesn't work directly with law enforcement. Yeah, Hood said, tone flat and decidedly unamused. But Dick totally noticed his lip twitch, as he resisted a smile. Score. No, I mean, come on, you need a shower. So you do care. Hood's semi-neutral, semi-irritated expression devolved into a full-blown scowl. As if. You're stinking up my apartment, dickface. So either you get your lazy ass up and shower, or you get your lazy ass up and out. Sure, who doesn't love a good ultimatum? Dick wouldn't hesitate to use this as an opportunity to see how Hood reacted if Dick took a faceplant. Maybe he could finally get a read on his intentions, if he thought Dick was that weak. Dick peeled the cloud-soft blanket away and proceeded to get to his feet, only for his legs to collapse beneath him like wet noodles. The room was spinning around him, a blur of cheap IKEA furniture and crime lord as tall as Batman. A firm grip on his arm kept him from hitting his head on the coffee table. Easy, Hood scolded, allowing Dick to lean on him. You've been through a lot, Dickie, even for you. Don't move so quickly. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks for the save. That wasn't even for show. Dick was genuinely just that out of it. Not good. A resigned sigh. Maybe a bath would be better. Here, sit back down. Okay, Dick thought to himself, as Hood scrubbed down the bathtub in the other room. This has to be the strangest crime lord he's ever met. Dick has met plenty of crime lords. Usually they want to kill him, or fuck him, or even use him to get to Batman. Having a crime lord who already knew his identity take care of him was a new experience. And frankly, Dick wouldn't mind if other crime lords took a page out of Hood's book. Deathstroke could learn a thing or two about how to treat his nemesis. So, Dick said casually as Hood came out of the bathroom, domino newly off. The crime lord had striking blue-green eyes, paired with raven-black hair. Dick couldn't help but think the guy looked a bit like an older, buffer version of Jason, especially when he made that expression, a mix of annoyance and bemusement. How'd you meet Batman? Take a wild guess, Hood growled, eyes flaring with barely restrained rage. Dick took that as a challenge. You locked eyes across the dark alley. He shot you the bat glare. You shot him, literally. It was hate at first sight. If you forgot how me and B met, then I'm not filling you in. If you want to know so bad, ask replacement, when he's better from being indisposed. Dick blinked. I've been told I have a pretty stellar memory, but the thing is, I don't remember meeting Red Hood outside of combat. Well, ever. And you have a pretty memorable thing going on. The outfit, the name. I think I'd remember if we knew each other. Hood's jaw actually dropped. You... He opened and closed his mouth a few times, at a loss for words. Dick frowned. What was Hood's game here? What's wrong? That got your tongue? Dick, you don't know who I am. No? Dick blinked. I thought that went without saying. Batman. That fucker didn't tell you. Dick's eyes widened. No way. No flipping way. Wait, Batman knows who you are? He didn't tell Dick. Oh. B was so in for it when he returned home. But why? Why protect the identity of a crime lord from Dick? Dick, Hood said slowly, with a grin as jagged and fragile as glass, his eyes stormy and wet. I'm Jason Todd, back from the dead, zombie edition. Chapter 6. I'm so in. Dick choked on a laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. A clone. Or a shapeshifter. Or a dimension traveler. Dick needed to run tests. He needed to leave. Retrieve equipment. He had to draw blood, take fingerprints, and make sure Clayface was still locked up in Arkham. All of those things were right. They were exactly what Batman would do. Exactly what Dick had been trained to do. Since he first started his career as Robin. What if it wasn't really Jason? Hugging him would be incredibly stupid. It would be an amateur move. It would make him naive, stupidly trusting, and totally blinded by his emotions. But those hard blue eyes, his skin tone, that birthmark on his neck. No, Dick knew better. And yet, if there was any chance in the universe that Jason was standing before him, back from the dead, zombie edition, Dick's heart clenched. That was such a Jason thing to say. Then Dick had no other choice. He took a step forward. It went against years of conditioning, drilled into him after living and training with the most paranoid man on Earth since his early childhood. Dick wrapped his arms around his little brother. Funny, Jason was taller than him now. His collarbone was at Dick's head, so instead of tucking him under his chin like he used to, he pressed his own face against Jason's chest, and breathed. Gunpowder, cigarettes, and from this close, heart doing gymnastics in his chest, Dick could detect the barest hint of lavender, Jason's favorite scent of shampoo. Jaybird, he said, voice cracking. You didn't know. Jason returned the hug, pulling Dick closer, tighter. There were so many things Dick wanted to say. He'd have spent so many hours sitting in front of Jason's tombstone, talking to the air, the soil, the coffin, the body buried underneath. Now, finally, he could speak to the real thing. Remember the first time we met? Jason tensed up. How could I forget? You made it pretty clear a little brother wasn't on your wish list. I was scared you'd throw a punch or something. I was so mad, Dick agreed. But not at you. At Dad, Bruce. Jason made a surprised noise. But I thought, you hated me. No, Dick said, gravelly. I never hated you. He gave you my colors, my name, and he didn't even ask me. I felt like I didn't matter, and then I found out he adopted you. For years, I was Bruce's ward, but you were his son. After a few months, I wasn't ready to let go of any of it. Robin wasn't Batman's invention, it was mine. And Bruce stole it from me, but gave it to you. And I wanted... When I first came to Bristol, I didn't want a new dad. And that was the last thing on my mind. But over the years, Bruce is my father. But he replaced me with someone else, someone he loved more. When I thought you pushed him, Gonzalez, off the roof, Jason went utterly still in Dick's arms. But Dick plowed on. He needed to get this off his chest. Well, I wasn't exactly disappointed. To be honest, I was really happy because it meant you screwed up, and I got proof that you weren't the perfect replacement. You weren't. Dick mumbled the last part, barely able to say it. Better than me. Dick, Jason said, stunned. He pulled back to look his big brother in the eyes, because there was no way that bullshit just came out of his mouth. Dick, Mr. Perfect, the original, was worried about not being good enough. About not being as good as Jason? Impossible. And yet... You're wrong. You're so crazy wrong. Dick shook his head. Bruce was always comparing me to you. I was Robin, but I wasn't the Robin. I wasn't Batman's partner, his equal like you were. I was barely even his sidekick. Bruce never trusted me. He didn't believe me when I said I didn't try to kill Gonzalez. He didn't believe I could be anything more than what I was. A street rat. I never had the chance because... Jason's voice cracked. He never gave me one. I didn't exactly help, Dick muttered. I was so caught up with my own Bruce-related drama that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Dick ruffled Jason's hair gently, eyes wet. My perfect little brother. It's all my fault. Everything. Of course you didn't feel like you could talk to me about Sheila. I would have been there, but I never gave you any reason to believe that. The past is past. Jason muttered with a shrug. You were 18. Don't be so hard on yourself. The brothers stood there for a little while longer, unwilling to let each other go. Dick never wanted this moment to end, but when it did, as long as Jason was still in his life, he would be okay. Jason wiped his eyes and returned Dick's smile with a playful smirk of his own. What's important is the future, like figuring out how we're gonna get back at Bruce. Oh, Jaybird, Dick said gleefully. I'm so in. Chapter 7. Get your priorities straight. Bruce shut the door to the Batmobile with a dull thud, and trudged across the cave towards the Bat-computer. It had been nearly 3 months since the League had been called off-planet, and this was his first time returning home in nearly twice as long. He needed to check up on Gotham. Then, once he knew his fair city wasn't at risk of crumbling to the ground, tonight anyway, he'd crawl up to his room and pass out for at least the next 2 days. Before he could reach his computer, Bruce noticed a hulking figure lurking in the corner of his vision, shrouded in the shadows of the stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Bruce had a batarang ready to go in an instant, facing the potential threat. Nightwing? Bruce asked, the silence soldiering on. His eyes narrowed. Whoever you are, show yourself, or I'll come to you. A heavy beat passed. Just when Bruce was sure he'd have to chase down whoever this was, he still wasn't 100% sure it wasn't one of the Robins playing a trick on him. The figure stepped out of the shadows. Bruce's heart stuttered in his chest. His breath caught. The batarang he brandished slipped from his fingers and landed with a clatter onto the cave floor. Hood. Bruce's voice was pure gravel. Look what the bat dragged in, Hood quipped. Then he took off his helmet. Bruce's eyes burned. What, no warm welcome? I get it. You're upset you had to pay for a whole ass funeral for me. 50 grand, and I'm still alive. How very inconvenient. The laugh he gave was in no way humorous. It was dark and grave, all jagged edges and watery eyes. When he strolled towards the memorial case, steps casual, but full of purpose, posture relaxed, despite the way his senses were going into overdrive, making him hyper-aware. He could hear Batman's breathing, quiet as it was. The sound of the bats fluttering with their leathery wings among the stalactites. Smell the faint, sweet tang of Alfred's herbal teas. What do we have here? Bruce remained stoic as ever. Jason dragged his fingers over the glass where the words, "A good soldier," were engraved. His smile twisted into something ugly. "Ah, I'm touched." "Jason," Bruce said. "Tut-tut," Jason sneered. "No names in the cave. That's rule number 1. Before either of them can say anything more, before there was time for screaming or fists or accusations or blades or bullets, Nightwing dropped down from the ceiling where he had been watching from above. "Hi, Bruce," he said, voice flat. "So Jason paid me a visit. Dick." Bruce's voice broke. Dick sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "Jason isn't happy with you right now, and I think he has good reason to be." Bruce flinched. "Dick, please let me talk. When Jay and I are done, you can say your piece. Jason is pissed off because you chose Robin over him, again and again, until it literally killed him." Bruce flinched. "First, you chose Robin over Jason when you benched him for not following Batman's honor code. You chose Robin over him when you assumed Jason would follow orders like a good little soldier and not try to save his mom because you were too busy being Batman to deal with Jason's issues. You chose Robin over Jason when you refused to accept and acknowledge Jason as your son, a person worthy of your love and respect, when he came back from the dead, but rejected Batman's honor code. You chose Robin, an idea, a symbol, over Jason, your own fucking son, when you didn't tell me my little brother is the Red Hood. When you decided yourself that Jason, the Red Hood, wasn't family. Our family. It's really fucked up." Dick took a breath, and was relieved when Batman didn't try to fill in the silence with denials, or, worse yet, accusations of being brainwashed. "Since when did being Batman become your whole fucking personality? Since when did you need your sons to be Robin? You adopted me. You picked me up because you remembered what it was like to be alone and angry. You didn't take me in as Robin. You took me in as Dick Grayson. But you chose Jason knowing he had that spark. That potential for vigilantism. The art museum proved it. He proved himself to Batman before he ever won Bruce Wayne's love. And he still hasn't earned it, huh? Guess what, Batman? We're sick of you. We want Bruce back. We shouldn't have to be Robin to be loved by our own father." The ensuing silence was deafening. Notes. Dick here was far more self-aware and calm compared to Canon Dick. This is Dick who serves the purpose of making this confrontation happen, not Dick who has his own emotional issues with Bruce. This is Dick compartmentalizing, something he was never very good at, in my opinion, and putting his issues aside in order to help Jason and Bruce understand each other. It's emotional, it's gritty, it's kind of unpleasant to read. Hope you enjoy it anyway. I'd also like to take this moment to remind you, I have never read Batman. If any elements or world-building/character developments don't line up with canon, that is the reason. Feel free to tell me in the comments. Also, IRL Dick's valiant confrontation would have likely sparked defensiveness in Bruce rather than make him consider seeing a different perspective. So that's not very realistic, but it's what you're getting. I know everyone has their own versions/perceptions of who Batman is, and why Jason is pissed off at him. This is my take. It's fine if you don't agree, but please, for the love of God, disagree politely. Such a good joke. I fucking love that joke. I fucking hate Alice in Wonderland. Me when I'm back, part 2, Zombie Edition. The announcer shot him a double thumbs up. This auctioneer is such a character. My man, he's like, yeah, these people were selling, they last far they last far longer in our care than they do other people around here. Like, we run such a good business. And then he turns around with the double thumbs up. Does this man have yowie hands? Is this Draco Malfoy? They've made full leather Jason. Devin's such a shitty name. Your options here are spend like 2 seconds undoing the clasp on the back of this ball gag. Or taking your very sharp knife and chancing cutting open your brother's face with it. Dick willed himself to pull away, but only succeeded in holding on to Dick. But only exceeded in. But only